Okay, well, first I want to thank the Museum of the Jewish Heritage for opening its space for this talk, and I'm very thankful also to New York University Press that has been so very actively involved in arranging this and obviously also bringing the book into life. And I want to thank everybody for coming. Obviously many of you are friends and family, so in some ways it's different kind of talking experience when I'm only speaking to strangers. So I appreciate everybody's presence here. So We Remember with Reverence and Love is my most recent book. Like each one that came before it, it represents a process of my identifying some problem in the past that intrigued me, some amount of time grappling with the process, with how to conceptualize a question about this problem, vastly longer periods of time spent in endless libraries and archives digging through mounds of material, followed by months and months and months of writing and rewriting. Each one of those books has a unique history in terms of why I decided to write what I did and how I did it. Each involved an exhilarating and exhausting labor of love. Each one was, in fact, a chapter in my life. But We Remember with Reverence and Love, unlike those other books, is a book that I actually should never have had to write. It is the only one of my books in which the initial impetus did not come from sort of desire to solve some historic puzzle or to reconstruct some aspect of the past for its own sake. Rather, this book was very different. My decision to embark upon it came from the fact that American and American Jewish historians, among others, have been involved for several decades now in the construction and dissemination of a false history about American Jews in the post-World War II period and their relationship to the Holocaust. In the dominant view of that history, the Jews of the United States, in the 20 years or so following the end of World War II, with its shuddering reality that 1/3 of the Jewish people had been destroyed, could not, would not, and did not make that horrendous reality part of their communal culture. Historians, journalists, Jewish community activists, and beyond have all agreed that a culture of silence stalked American Jewry. Whether writing from the left or from the right, whether writing from within the Jewish community or from without, they have converged around a communal consensus that has asserted that post-World War II American Jews that have converged around a communal consensus that has asserted that as Jews found American society opening up to them in new and welcome ways after the end of the war, they decided quite affirmatively that the Holocaust could not be part of their repertoire of concerns. The leaders of their communal institutions, the other historians have told us, in particular, put the lid on any talk of the Holocaust, making sure that the memorialization of the deaths of the 6 million at the hands of the Germans and their allies did not take place. That horrific topic had to be bracketed, marginalized, and talk of it, particularly in the larger public sphere when confronting the American public, had to be squelched. This kind of rhetoric coming out of the pens, or I guess now we might say off the screens or the keyboards, of historians, scholars committed to the laws of evidence, have been dominant since the 1980s. And when I first confronted this narrative about the past, it took me aback and caused me to wonder how this could have been. First, if American Jews had in actuality decided to forget those brutal deaths and not dwell on the destruction, they would have acted in ways that were different than probably any other group of human beings at any other time in history. That is, wherever and whenever human beings have lived, they have memorialized the tragedies which have confronted their communities. So how amazing it must be that only the Jews of the United States in the period after World War II deviated from that universal norm. Secondly, I wondered, Okay? Well, had the Jews of the United States really followed the orders imposed upon them by some communal elite and had agreed to the directions to remain silent about the Holocaust, they would have, for at least that moment in time, also deviated from the basic narrative of American Jewish history. The kind of communal discipline that I, as a historian, know never existed, that kind of communal discipline I know never existed. American Jewish history in that period, and indeed for the 300 years before it, has in fact been the history of anarchy, creative for sure, of multiple and constantly changing groupings scuffling with each other over the nature of Judaism, Jewish identity, Jewish politics, Jewish community life, with no one able to dictate what should be said, when, and how. And finally, the communal consensus that maintained that the Holocaust lay buried below the surface of American Jewish life until the middle or end of the 1960s, it grabbed my attention because it flew in the face of my memories of the post-war period. Now, while I am generally very skeptical about using personal recollections as the basis for history, particularly after this book, I'm now convinced they're totally useless, such recollections can in fact be very helpful as ways to start our historical inquiries. And I wondered, well, was I misremembering the American Jewish world of the 1950s and the early 1960s that I grew up in which talk of the Holocaust and texts of the Holocaust and performances of it were everywhere? Or did my experiences of the Holocaust, the ones that I had remembered, was it just unusual, and did they jar profoundly with those of other American Jews in other places at that time? Now, had the other historians offered a more complicated and nuanced interpretation of post-war American Jewish history and the role of the Holocaust in it, and had they actually done any real scholarship, I might have never written this book. But rather, they stated and restated again as a given that from the years of 1945 until some say 1961, most converge around 1967, that in the United States, the Jews did not use the Holocaust to advance their political or cultural agenda, nor did they invest time or energy in telling about it or memorializing it. Since my fellow historians created this version of the past, I felt compelled to step in and find out what actually did happen. I wanted to know not what the historians were saying, but what the women and men who constituted the Jews of the United States in the post-war period said and did in relationship to the Holocaust. What did they create in terms of rituals and words and images to make their world a place which recognized the enormity of the loss, and how did they understand the burden which that loss placed upon them? Now, before I talk about the specifics of the book, I just want to just tick off a few assumptions that I worked with in putting this together. Most importantly, the assumption that underlays this book is that the size and the shape and the intent and the nature of later Holocaust projects, this museum, as a good example, ought not be considered the yardstick against which to measure the earlier efforts at memorialization. That what came later in the 1980s, 1990s, I guess the 2000s, was for sure larger, better organized, more systematic, and much more connected to the general American culture. But that does not mean that a previous generation collaborated in a conspiracy of silence. Secondly, I assume in this book that it mattered very little what my subjects, again, the women and men of post-World War II America, had to say about this event. It didn't matter really what they called it. Did they call it the catastrophe with a lowercase c, or the catastrophe with an uppercase C? Did they call it the 6 million Hitler times? One young woman called it the dark reign of terror under Hitler. if they called it Holocaust, Nazi Holocaust, Hitler Holocaust, if the word Holocaust had a capital H or a lowercase case, none of that mattered, and they invested little time in trying to figure out what to call it. They knew what it was, and they acted upon it.